The courtroom was cold, not from the air, but from the silence that surrounded her, the kind of silence that screams of injustice before a word is even spoken. They led Jasmine Brooks, a quiet 15-year-old black girl, into courtroom B, the smallest and most neglected room in the courthouse. Her lip was bloodied, her wrists bound in tight steel cuffs, and yet not a single person asked how she had gotten that way. They called her the problem. Said she caused a scene at the mall, said she obstructed police work, but no one in that courtroom cared that what really happened was she filmed Officer Brian Keller as he violently shoved an elderly black man to the pavement. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't resist. She simply pulled out her phone and recorded the truth. That video, raw and honest, circulated online just long enough for someone powerful to notice and decide she needed to be silenced. When Jasmine entered the courtroom, no one looked at her like a child. They looked at her like a criminal. Officer Keller stood at the witness table, arms crossed, his glare sharp and demeaning. He approached her not to testify, but to intimidate, and without warning he slapped her across the face. The crack of his hand against her cheek echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. And still the judge, the bailiff, the attorneys, none of them moved. The silence wasn't confusion. It was permission. But Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She wiped the blood from her lip and whispered a line that cut deeper than the slap itself. You just made it federal. And from the back of the courtroom, a woman in a dark blazer adjusted her watch twice, setting into motion something none of them were ready for. The moment those 5 words, "You just made it federal," left, Jasmine Brooks' mouth, a subtle but seismic shift, rattled the courtroom's stale, stagnant air. Officer Brian Keller took a half-step back, not from orders or rebuke, but from something far more unsettling, the unshakable calm in Jasmine's voice. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for justice, it announces it. As her blood slowly pooled at the corner of her lip, Jasmine didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't even look toward the judge. Instead, she raised her cuffed hands with quiet defiance and wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve, not as a victim, but as someone preparing for battle. And in the far back row, barely noticeable amidst the sea of polished shoes and crossed arms, the woman in the dark blazer, Marilyn Pierce, moved, not dramatically, not urgently, just a smooth, practiced adjustment of the dial on her watch. A small, calculated gesture, but to anyone who had seen it before, it was a signal. She didn't gasp when Jasmine was hit. She didn't stand or object. She didn't need to. Because Marilyn Pierce wasn't there to react, she was there to watch, to document, to remember. Back at the front, Officer Keller casually resumed his place near the witness stand, as though he hadn't just assaulted a teenager in open court. He adjusted his uniform, flicked the mic, and launched into his prepared testimony with the mechanical precision of a man used to manipulating the system. According to him, Jasmine wasn't a brave girl who recorded an injustice. No, she was aggressive, disruptive, defiant. He used words like combative and resistant, each syllable coated with the authority of someone who knew his badge would protect him from scrutiny, and the courtroom let it happen. The Assistant District Attorney, Rebecca Slater, sat silently at her desk, not even bothering to look up from her legal pad. She didn't ask a single question, didn't cross-examine. She nodded quietly to herself, as if Officer Keller's story wasn't just believable, it was expected. Judge Douglas Keene finally moved, picking up a pen like he was signing off on a parking ticket, not deciding the fate of a teenage girl. He didn't address Jasmine, didn't even glance at her. His eyes never left the paper. As he scribbled notes and passed the docket to the clerk, it became painfully clear the outcome had already been decided. Jasmine wasn't there to be heard. She was there to be processed, forgotten. Jasmine's public defender Michael Tran shifted nervously in his seat. He leaned toward her and whispered something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps resignation, but Jasmine didn't respond. She kept her eyes locked on the floor in front of her, like she was counting the cracks in the tiles instead of the cracks forming in the justice system around her. Behind her, Marilyn Pierce had taken out a small notepad. She wasn't filming. She wasn't typing. She was writing in long, careful strokes, her face unreadable. She knew this wasn't a trial. It was a performance. And someone needed to write the real story. In that moment, Jasmine's silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. It wasn't that no one was listening. It was that someone, the right someone, was finally watching. And soon the courtroom would find out just how dangerous it was to mistake quiet for weakness. The courtroom sat steeped in an unsettling quiet, the kind that hangs heavy when the damage has already been done, but no one dares to speak of it. Jasmine Brooks, still cuffed, still bleeding, didn't ask for attention, but she had it. Everyone in the room was now watching her differently, not as the criminal they had presumed her to be, but as something far more dangerous to their comfort, a mirror to their indifference, a mirror to the truth. And behind her, in the last row, Marilyn Pierce's pen finally stilled. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes had sharpened, narrowed ever so slightly as the fabricated testimony poured from Officer Keller's lips, like a well-rehearsed lie. She didn't need outrage to make her move, she just needed timing. Then, like a ripple-breaking surface tension, Michael Tran stood up. His voice was uncertain at first, but firm enough to catch the attention of the room. "Your Honor," he began, "I'd like to submit new evidence, civilian video footage from a store across the street, time-stamped and directly related to the incident in question." There was a pause. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't breathe. The clerk brought over a monitor, and for the first time that morning, even the gallery leaned forward, not to judge, but to see. The grainy footage came to life on the screen, an elderly black man, slow-moving and confused, clutching a cane, stumbling as Officer Keller pushed him without provocation. Moments later, Jasmine stepped into the frame, shouting, not aggressive, but calmly stepping between the officer and the man, her arms raised, not in defiance, but in protection. A child shielding someone 3 times her age. It was quiet after the video ended. So quiet that for just a breath it seemed like the lie might collapse under the weight of the truth. But then Judge Keene leaned back, waved his hand dismissively, and declared the footage unverified. Just like that, the flicker of hope was extinguished. The ADA, Rebecca Slater, gave a faint, dismissive smile. "Nice clip," she said, voice smooth like ice, but nice doesn't mean admissible. The screen went dark. The monitor unplugged, and the room swallowed the truth like it was something inconvenient, something disposable. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply stared at the blank screen, her expression unreadable, as her defense was wiped away with the wave of a hand. Behind her, Marilyn Pierce didn't flinch. She didn't look rattled. Instead, she reached for her wrist again, a precise 2-tap gesture against her watch face. No one else noticed. They were too busy pretending nothing meaningful had just happened. But that subtle signal wasn't for them. It was for the eyes watching outside the courtroom, the ones who would not forget, who would not allow this lie to become official record. Something had been marked. Not just in ink on court documents, but in intent. The law had spoken, but justice hadn't. And somewhere just beneath the floorboards of that courtroom, a reckoning had begun to stir. What followed wasn't an explosion. It was a quiet dismantling. Officer Keller returned to his seat. Like nothing had happened, the courtroom sliding back into its scripted rhythm. Jasmine Brooks remained still, her hands folded over her backpack, her back straight, her eyes steady. No one reached out to her. No one apologized. And yet something in the room had changed. It wasn't loud, but it was palpable, a tension humming just beneath the silence. Behind her, Marilyn Pierce never looked up from her notepad, but her presence now felt unmistakable. Her fingers rested calmly on her pen, yet her wrist still bearing that matte black watch told a different story. It wasn't a fashion piece. It wasn't for style. It was for those who knew a device built for signaling under surveillance, the kind issued to high-level operatives operating in compromised spaces. At the front, Judge Keene reached for the next docket like this morning's hearing was already in the past. Ada Slater reorganized her files, her expression unreadable. Officer Keller leaned toward his fellow officer, Dean Harlow, whispering low and smug. "She won't last long." His words weren't about justice. They were about breaking her, reducing Jasmine's resolve to the same silence they had already imposed on the truth. But she didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed forward, fixed, not on people, but on purpose. That stillness, they all mistook it for submission. But it was strategy focus. And someone was watching. Suddenly the side door opened, and Officer Harlow stepped in, this time with paperwork in hand, citing an evidence check on Jasmine's personal belongings. Judge Keene didn't blink. Ada Slater didn't ask for explanation. It was all too convenient, too timed, and entirely too familiar. No one questioned the search. Harlow moved to the defense table with authority, and Keller joined him uninvited but expected. Jasmine's attorney, Michael Tran, rose to object, but was quickly silenced by Slater's cold assurance. They're just doing their job. They weren't searching. They were scavenging. They opened Jasmine's bag, upended her folders, spilled her colored pencils and notebooks across the table and floor. A sandwich fell out and was kicked aside. A photo fluttered to the ground and was stepped on. No one stopped them. Not the judge. Not the bailiff. Not even the jury. Jasmine sat frozen, watching her life, her identity, be spread across the courtroom like contraband, and still she didn't cry. She stood slowly, gathered her things piece by piece, folded her sandwich back into the foil, straightened the bent photo, and zipped her backpack with shaking hands. Behind her, Marilyn Pierce tapped the edge of her watch once. Then again. No words, no movement, just a signal. The courtroom may have pretended not to see, but someone had seen enough. The line had been crossed, and what came next would not be stopped. The courtroom tried to return to order, but the air had shifted. Every face wore the same look of strained pretense, as if pretending nothing had happened could erase the violation that had just unfolded. Jasmine Brooks sat quietly beside her repacked bag, her wrists still cuffed, her breath steady. But behind that calm was something sharpened. Not rage, not fear. Something older. Preparedness. Her silence was not submission, it was waiting. And behind her, still seated like a statue in the last row, Marilyn Pierce raised her wrist one final time and delivered 2 deliberate taps on her watch. A confirmation. A call. A countdown. The response wouldn't come from the judge's bench, nor the defense table, nor the jury. It would come from far beyond these walls. Suddenly, the courtroom doors creaked open once more. It wasn't dramatic, but the tension in the room spiked instantly. Officer Dean Harlow entered again. Only this time he wasn't alone. At his side was a man in a fitted dark suit, calm and direct in his movements, holding a small leather case. No badge was shown, yet. No words exchanged, but everyone felt the pressure change. Harlow approached the bench, offering a folded slip of paper to the clerk and muttering about a routine evidence check. No one questioned it. Judge Keene nodded without lifting his head. ADA Slater didn't blink. Even Michael Tran sat tense, unsure whether to intervene or observe. But Jasmine did neither. She reached slowly into the front pouch of her backpack and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, handing it silently to her attorney. Tran read it once, confused, then again slower this time. Just a few words written in tiny handwriting. Don't act. They're watching. I'm ready. He glanced toward her wrist where the edge of a sleek matte black watch peeked from under her sleeve. It wasn't store-bought. It wasn't for fashion. It was government-issued, the kind designed for silent signaling under threat. The implications hit him like a jolt. This wasn't just a scared girl. Jasmine Brooks was someone trained, prepared, connected. He leaned close, whispering, "Who's watching?" For the first time that day, Jasmine turned her head. Slowly, deliberately. Her eyes locked onto Marilyn Pierce in the back row. And then, for just a breath of a second, mother and daughter locked eyes, not with panic, not with tears, but with silent electricity. Recognition. Alliance. Intention. There was no nod, no smile, just a connection so unmistakable that those who caught it would never forget it. And in that moment, for the first time since she walked into the courtroom, Jasmine Brooks was no longer alone. And justice was no longer waiting, it was approaching. Officer Keller leaned forward again, his voice low but purposefully sharp, meant only for Jasmine Brooks to hear. "No one's here for you," he muttered, eyes narrowed with smug certainty. "Not even your mother." The words were meant to cut, to fracture her resolve, to chip away at her dignity the way the system had been doing all morning. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't even look at him. Because what Keller didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that Jasmine had already won the moment they underestimated her. And as if on cue, a soft scrape echoed through the courtroom like a match being struck in silence. A single wooden chair slid back from the last row. The room turned. Marilyn Pierce was standing, not with fury, not with drama, but with a calm so unnerving it made even the bailiff straighten in place. She moved slowly with measured grace, like someone who had trained for years to walk into danger, not away from it. Her heels clicked softly on the tile floor, each step a statement, each movement slicing through the courtroom's indifference like a blade. Even before she reached the center aisle, all eyes were on her. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others held their breath. No one spoke. Not even the judge. Judge Keene finally looked up, blinking, as if pulled from a trance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice wavering for the first time, "please return to your seat." But Marilyn Pierce didn't stop. She walked with the quiet confidence of a woman who didn't need permission because she had already come with authority. As she reached the center of the courtroom, her hand slipped into the inside of her blazer. A ripple of unease passed through the gallery. Keller's shoulders stiffened. ADA Slater put down her pen, and then, with deliberate precision, Marilyn opened a slim black case. Inside a CIA badge, unmistakable, engraved and shimmering beneath the dull overhead lights. Her voice, steady and unwavering, echoed through the stunned room. Agent Marilyn Pierce. Central Intelligence Agency, Division of Internal Oversight. The silence that followed was more than silence, it was collapse. The room froze in collective disbelief. ADA Slater's jaw tightened. Judge Keene clutched the edge of the bench. Keller went pale like someone watching his entire foundation begin to crack beneath his feet. And Jasmine Brooks, didn't smile, didn't flinch. She simply sat a little straighter. Because justice had just walked in, and it was wearing a badge no one saw coming. The badge hung in the air like a gavel crashing through silence. Marilyn Piercino, longer just the silent woman in the back row, but a CIA agent with full oversight authority, had irrevocably shifted the balance of power in that courtroom. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She simply opened a folder with quiet finality and began to read her voice, steady and surgical. 4 years ago, Officer Brian Keller used excessive force on a 14-year-old boy in the Kingsdale district. The boy sustained a dislocated shoulder. No arrest, no charges. Complaint dismissed. Case closed, but the file remains. Each line she read was a scalpel cutting through years of buried corruption. She turned the page. 3 years ago, Officer Dean Harlow was implicated in tampering with evidence, specifically narcotics, from a locked facility. Internal Affairs flagged the chain of custody. ADA Rebecca Slater declined prosecution. The courtroom, once smug and composed, now shifted uncomfortably. The spectators, some who had laughed at Jasmine just an hour before, were suddenly looking at her with new eyes. This wasn't the story they expected, and it certainly wasn't the outcome they prepared for. Marilyn continued, 1 year ago, a 15-year-old female black was listed as a key witness in a local abuse case involving both officers Keller and Harlow. After repeated contact from the officers, she recanted her testimony. The judge, Douglas Keene, ruled her claims inadmissible. Case dismissed before hearing. The weight of it was staggering. Every name, every decision, every cover-up. And all of it had been orchestrated under the illusion of lawful procedure. Ada Slater's voice cracked. This isn't relevant to the case at hand. Marilyn didn't even look at her. Covering crimes is always relevant. The words landed like a verdict of their own. Then she stepped forward and laid a second folder on the clerk's desk. Federal orders. Signed and issued this morning at 6:28 a.m. Authorization for immediate detainment. The seal shimmered under the courthouse lights like a quiet kind of vengeance. The side door opened again, not for noise, but for execution. 2 federal agents in suits stepped in and moved swiftly, one toward Keller, one toward Harlow. Keller's chair scraped sharply as he stood too fast, panic on his face. Harlow didn't get a word out before the click of handcuffs cut through the air like punctuation. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. A juror leaned forward, forgetting to be impartial. And Jasmine. She didn't move. She watched it all unfold with a kind of calm that said, "I knew you'd come." Because the courtroom had never truly belonged to the judge or the prosecutor. It now belonged to the truth. As the courtroom trembled under the weight of revelation, it no longer felt like a space for deliberation. It felt like a reckoning. Officer Keller and Harlow, once so confident in their untouchable status, were escorted out in silence, their cuffs gleaming like poetic justice under the courtroom's flickering lights. No one moved to stop it, not the bailiff, not ADA Slater, not even Judge Keene. The authority they once clung to had dissolved in the face of irrefutable truth. Their careers, their power, their facade undone by the girl they tried to silence and the mother they never saw coming. When the agents disappeared through the side door with the disgraced officers in tow, Marilyn Pierce turned not toward the bench but toward Jasmine. Their eyes met again, and though no smile crossed either of their faces, there was a recognition of triumph that didn't need to be spoken. Jasmine had not been rescued. She had stood her ground, endured, waited, and earned every second of this moment. And now, as she sat with her wrists uncuffed for the first time that morning, she looked less like a defendant and more like what she truly was, a witness, a survivor, and a catalyst. The silence in the courtroom lingered. But it had changed. It was no longer the silence of complicity or fear. It was the silence that follows truth, the kind that settles like dust after a storm has finally passed. Riley Tran, her public defender, stood beside Jasmine, now not with legal notes or objections, but with a quiet reverence. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She had spoken louder than any argument ever could with her restraint, her stillness, her refusal to yield. Then, with a voice that didn't need to rise to command attention, Marilyn addressed the court one last time. "This isn't justice. It's damage control," she said. Her words struck not like a gavel, but like a mirror held up to the system. What you just saw wasn't a mistake. It was the system working exactly as designed until someone refused to move. She didn't say Jasmine's name. She didn't have to. The gallery, once filled with skeptical spectators, now sat shoulder to shoulder in stillness. One woman rose, then another, then a man in the back, then a row. They didn't shout. They didn't protest. They stood for Jasmine, for truth, for the silence that fought back. And Jasmine, she didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just placed her feet flat on the floor, her back straight, her eyes forward. Not a defendant anymore, a symbol, a mirror, and the system couldn't look away. The gallery stood not with applause, but with purpose, a collective, wordless gesture of solidarity that filled the courtroom with more weight than any ruling ever could. It was not about Jasmine Brooks alone anymore. It was about what she represented, the quiet resistance of those who've endured the strength in refusing to be erased the truth that had always been there waiting to be seen. She sat still at the defense table, her hands now free, her cuffs gone, but their memory still present in the air. And then from the back of the room, the sharp mechanical click of a camera shutter broke the silence. A young reporter who had been silent for hours finally raised her phone. The red light blinked. The world was about to witness what this courtroom tried to bury. Jasmine didn't turn toward the lens. She didn't need to. She simply stood slow and composed and walked past the defense table, her steps as deliberate as her silence had been. She moved through the center aisle with the same grace her mother had earlier, not with pride, but with dignity. No raised fist, no shouted vindication. Just presence, the kind that lingers long after footsteps fade. And as she passed the rows of people now standing for her, a little girl no older than 10, her hair braided tightly and her jacket patched at the shoulder with a butterfly, looked up at Jasmine with unblinking eyes. "That's her," she whispered to her mother. "That's the girl who didn't yell." Jasmine paused, turned slightly, and gave the girl a small nod. It wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't for the crowd. It was for that little girl and every other child watching from the margins. Outside, the courthouse doors swung open. There was no parade, no podium, just air, sunlight, and space. Jasmine stepped out onto the stone steps, her shoulders square, her chin lifted, her mother walking beside her, not shielding her, not leading, just walking with her. The wind caught the edge of Jasmine's sleeve as she descended the stairs, and for a moment the silence followed her like a crown. A few reporters stood at a distance, unsure whether to speak. No one dared shout a question, because they all knew this wasn't the kind of story that ended with a soundbite. It ended the only way it ever could, with a girl who never raised her voice, and still made the world stop and listen. As Jasmine and her mother descended the courthouse steps, the quiet around them felt sacred. There were no flashing cameras in their faces, no frenzy of reporters, only the sound of her steady footsteps echoing against the stone, and the hushed awe of a crowd that had just witnessed something extraordinary. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Behind her, the courthouse, the same place that had tried to strip her voice, now stood as the backdrop to her quiet victory. And in that silence, a truth settled deeply. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes the most powerful force in the room is the one that never had to shout to be heard. Later that afternoon, as the clip of Jasmine's story swept through social media, it wasn't outrage that carried it. It was recognition. Teachers wrote her words on classroom whiteboards. Mothers shared the video with daughters. Because sometimes Jasmine had said softly, "Silence isn't fear. It's strategy." And that's the life lesson we take from Jasmine Brooks, that you don't have to meet injustice with noise to make an impact. Sometimes dignity, composure, and quiet resolve are the loudest responses of all. So, what about you? Have you ever witnessed a moment when silence spoke louder than words? Tell us in the comments. We read every story. And if Jasmine's story moved you even a little, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful human-centered stories that deserve to be heard. Because here we don't just tell stories, we remember what silence teaches.